Hey everybody, happy Mother's Day weekend. I hope you have a terrific Mother's Day and are well celebrated. We're talking about hope these days throughout Community Christian Church. Last week we started a series called Hope Here and Now, and we're talking about this because all of us can use a strong dose of hope in our lives. I mean, hope is essential for human life to thrive. Without it, our lives start to fade. And so we're rolling up our sleeves in this series, and we're digging into several different characters in the Bible, people who were really in some challenging circumstances, and we're learning where they discovered a surefire hope and what they did to embrace that hope. You know, last week we looked at David, who found himself in a cave, and today I want us to meet somebody named Elijah. Now, it's important to have a bit of a backdrop to make the most of Elijah's story. Elijah was a prophet of God. You know, there was a period of time in the history of the nation of Israel where they had all these prophets that God rose up and he sent to speak on behalf of him. And most often their job was to warn people. They would hear from God, these prophets, and then they would speak on behalf of God, and they would say, you know, you need to turn around. You can't keep going down this path. If you don't make some changes, you're headed for disaster. And sometimes they would actually describe what the disaster was going to be. Now, here's what's going on in Israel in Elijah's time. The nation of Israel, it was split into two different kingdoms. They had the northern kingdom, creatively named because it was in the north, and the southern kingdom, named because of their accent and their love for sweet tea. And Jeroboam was the first king of the northern kingdom, and he faced a bit of a conundrum. He had all these people in the northern kingdom who were accustomed to traveling south to the city of Jerusalem, where the great temple was, the place of the worship of God. And as the king of the northern kingdom, Jeroboam, he didn't want all these people traveling south to the southern kingdom to worship. He didn't want them moving there and traveling there and living there. He wanted them to stay in the northern kingdom. And so he came up with a solution. He made some idols, some fake or false gods, and he found some false gods that had been kept in storage from hundreds of years earlier. And instead of being destroyed, these false gods had been put in a storage unit right alongside Han Solo and Carbonite, you know. And Jeroboam, he said to all the people, look, you don't want to be traveling all the way down south to worship God. I mean, traffic is a mess. You can't find a parking space down there or anything. Just stay here in the northern kingdom, and you can worship these other gods. And so idolatry, the worship of something or someone other than the one true God, it's reintroduced in a very significant way to the nation of Israel. And then we read about these different kings coming and going, the succession of different kings, from one king to the next king to the next king to the next king. And idolatry, it becomes more and more prevalent until we get to a guy named King Ahab. Now, if you have a Bible, I'd like for you to get to the book of 1 Kings, the 16th chapter of 1 Kings, beginning in verse 29. And here's what we read about Ahab. Ahab, son of Omri, became king of Israel, and he reigned in Samaria over Israel 22 years. Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. So Ahab is an evil kind of king, and he sets a new record for evil and idolatry that had just gotten way out of control under his reign. And part of the problem was his wife. His wife's name was Jezebel, and she was the princess of the Sidonians, and she came on the scene, and she wanted to build a temple to the worship of her god, which was the god Bel, the god of weather that they worshiped in her country. And Ahab more or less put her in charge of religion in the northern kingdom, and so she adopts as her agenda to destroy the worship of God, of Yahweh in Israel, and to replace him with the worship of her god, Bel. We're told in 1 Kings 18:4 that she tries to carry this out, among other ways, by systematically killing the prophets of the Lord, which was unprecedented. I mean, prophets in Israel had this kind of diplomatic immunity. I mean, you'll see this sometimes where kings would have some friction with the prophets. You know, not often, or oftentimes they didn't like the prophets. Sometimes they outright hated them, but they wouldn't dare harm them. But not Jezebel. She's having them murdered in cold blood. That's the situation that the northern kingdom is in. And eventually God says, enough of this. And so he sends Elijah with this message for King Ahab. And here's what he says. Here's the message from God, 1 Kings 17, verse 1, as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except at my word. All right. So Elijah says there's going to be a drought. And not only will there not be any rain, but there's not even going to be any dew on the grass when you wake up in the morning. That's how dry it's going to be. And so Elijah gives this message to King Ahab. Now, one of the things you'll see if you ever study the prophets is that the theme of the prophets, and in some ways you could say the theme of the Old Testament, is idolatry. It's the number one problem in the Bible. The first two of the 10 commandments deal with idolatry. There are more than 1,000 verses that speak to idolatry. I mean, God takes idolatry really seriously. And the reason it's such a big deal is because it has to do with the glory of God. You see, your story and my story and the great story we find ourselves in, it's all about the glory of God. So where there's idolatry, the glory of God is being robbed from Him and given to another. And that's not how we're wired. That's not how we're made. And so we read a ton about idolatry throughout the Old Testament in particular, specifically through the prophets. But we tend to skip over it because it just seems a little odd to us. It seems like, it's irrelevant to us. It seems like that was a problem for then, but not necessarily a problem for us now. I mean, I don't have carved statues of some kind. I'm not bowing down to some golden image in my life, and I doubt most of you are either. It just doesn't seem to relate to us. But, and this is a big but, the human heart hasn't changed all that much. We haven't evolved in some way like this. Our idols just look a bit different. You see, the question is, where do you put your hope? What holds the seat of glory in your heart? And for many of us, we're looking somewhere other than the Lord God to kind of fill that position in our lives. And we could name all kinds of things. I mean, it could be a relationship, a person, a spouse, kids, a parent, some significant other, the romantic relationship. We do this. We idolize the romantic relationship in our culture like no other. Instead of looking for God to complete you, you look to a person to complete you. But it can be anything, an object, a home, a boat, money. It could be a career or status or image. It could be sexual gratification or sexual identity. We say, I need, whatever it is, you fill in the blank. I need this to do what God wants to do for me, what only God can do for me. Ultimately satisfy me, give me a sense of security and meaning. But I want this to be how I'm known. And in these ways, what we're doing as we elevate those things in our life, we're robbing God of His glory. I mean, our idols are just as real. They just might be a little more difficult for us to identify. Ultimately, an idol is anything or anyone other than God that takes the passion and the value and the hope and the glory and the commitment of your life. It's a kind of cheap substitute for God, you see. I'm probably not the only one who still loves sugar cereal. I don't know if any of you are with me there. I mean, I like a good bowl of cereal. It's hard to beat a good bowl of Frosted Flakes. That's what I found. Or Cinnamon Toast Crunch, or Lucky Charms, or Cocoa Pebbles, or Fruity Pebbles. I could go on and on and on. But Frosted Flakes kind of take the cake for me. I mean, they're simple, they're delicious, they have a great catchphrase, they have a good mascot, they're readily available. Now, early on in our marriage, my wife Melanie, she would look to save a few pennies here and there, and one way to do that was to buy an off-brand of cereal, a cereal that's playing off the good sugar cereal. And at some point in our marriage, she tried replacing Frosted Flakes with something called Polar Flakes, all right? All because we'd save like 38 cents or something along those lines. And at first, I tried them. I really did. I gave it a good old college try. But they just weren't the same. Polar Flakes are not Frosted Flakes. Frosted Flakes, I mean, you probably know the catchphrase from Tony the Tiger, what he says about Frosted Flakes. He says, they're great. Polar Flakes, their catchphrase comes from a polar bear. Polly the polar bear, like Like that's realistic at all. A polar bear eating cereal. Come on, I wasn't born yesterday, And the catchphrase for Polar Flakes is something like, they're so-so. They're just not the same. Now, here's what I think we do. We are surrounded in our culture. We are kind of force-fed all these cheap substitutes for God. And we don't think much about it because we're just used to it. We don't really notice it anymore because we just kind of learned to say, well, okay, I'm going to find my hope and my pleasure in these things, whatever it is, my security, my identity, and these other things. But every once in a while, we have these moments where we think, this can't be all there is. I mean, I can't quite put my finger on it, but this can't be all there is. And it's because we've settled for something other than God to satisfy us, to be our hope, to be in the position of glory in our lives. We've settled for a cheap substitute. So God addresses idolatry. He speaks to the people again and again and again through the prophets, warning them about where this is leading and what's going to happen. And now he says to Ahab through Elijah, he says, look, a drought is coming. You've been warned. There's not going to be any rain. There's not going to be any dew on the ground. And you're going to see who the real God is. And then God says to Elijah, he says, I want you to go and hide. And so Elijah does. Then there are a series of miracles in Elijah's life. God uses ravens to bring Elijah bread and meat twice a day. I mean, it's amazing. Elijah is fed by birds twice a day. Twice a day, the ravens come, Ray and Ed and Lamar, and they feed Elijah. And he drinks water from the brook there. And when that dries up because of the drought, he sends Elijah to a widow who generously and sacrificially provides for Elijah. It's an incredible string of events in Elijah's life. And then it's time for Elijah to come out of hiding. And he basically sets up a cage match between the Lord and the prophets of Baal, these false gods. Elijah, he's going to force Israel to decide, who's your God going to be? His name, Elijah, it actually consists of that confession. Jah comes from Yahweh and El from Elohim. The Lord, Yahweh, is Elohim, God. That's Elijah's name. The Lord is God. That's his name. That's his mission too. And so in 1 Kings 18, verse 19, Elijah says to King Ahab again, he's come out of hiding now. He confronts King Ahab again. He says, now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. So Ahab sent word throughout all Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. Now, you imagine this scene here. Ahab sends the word throughout the entire kingdom. The whole country is gathered there. And on one side stands 450 prophets of Baal and 400 of the prophets of Asherah, 850 prophets of idols. On that side over here stands the king and all the power of all, the government, all the armies. On that side is the freedom to do whatever the people want to do. There are no 10 commandments on that side. There's no law on that side that says you have to care for anyone other than yourself. There's no call for devotion to God or to other people. It's just idolatry, and it promises sexual pleasure as part of the cult and material abundance as part of it as well. And on the other side is one man, one solitary prophet who emerges from years of hiding to confront a king and confront a country single-handedly. But with that man, that one man is their God, the God who made them a country, the God of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah. And Elijah, in an act of unbelievable courage, takes on the whole nation. Look at verse 21, where all the people are assembled there on Mount Carmel. Elijah went before the people, and this is just unbelievable courage. Elijah went before the people and said, how long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. And then we read such a sad verse. But the people said nothing. I mean, why did they say nothing? Well, it's because they wanted both. I mean, if they wanted God, they would have said, we choose God. If they wanted Baal, they would have said, we choose Baal. But they said nothing because they wanted both. And I think this is true for a lot of us too. It's not that we don't want God in our lives. We just want God and something else. We want him to kind of share the position of glory, and God just doesn't work that way. God says, you're going to have to choose who is first, who really is your top commitment and your top priority. The human heart is capable of giving its ultimate allegiance. Your heart is capable of giving your ultimate devotion to only one master, only one. Jesus said that no one can serve two masters, and that's true. And Elijah says you have to choose, but no one says a word. And so Elijah gives these instructions, for this sort of showdown on Mount Carmel there, verse 25. He says to them, choose one of the bulls and prepare it first, since there are so many of you. Call on the name of your God, but don't light the fire. So they took the bull given them and prepared it, and then they called on the name of Baal from morning till noon. "O Baal, answer us," they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered. They danced around the altar that they had made. At noon, this is great. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. So they had been doing this for quite some time. And Elijah, he starts talking a little trash. Elijah might be the patron saint of trash talking. He says, shout louder. Surely he's a God. Perhaps he's deep in thought. Maybe he's busy. He's using the gift of sarcasm here, his spiritual gift of sarcasm to show how ridiculous it is to pray to a God who isn't there. See? He can see how silly it is to put your hope in something that we make. He says, well, maybe he's traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and must be awakened. So they shouted louder, slashed themselves with swords and spears until their blood flowed. This is a tragic scene as they try to get the attention of these false gods, and they're bleeding for these gods, hoping that that'll be enough, hoping that will satisfy. It's all ridiculous, Elijah says. And so he kind of taunts them a little bit. This went on for hours, all day long. And finally, Elijah just puts an end to it. It's his turn. Baal's had his chance, and now it's God's turn. And so Elijah, he calls the people over to him. He very carefully prepares the altar. Verse 31 says he takes 12 stones, and 12 is a very significant number. The Bible says he takes one for each of the 12 tribes of the nation of Israel. He's reminding them of their identity. He's reminding the people of who it was that made them and called them a nation, you see. Then he has this trench dug around the altar. He puts wood on the altar. He drenches it in gallons and gallons and gallons of water. He's making this more difficult for himself. But then he prays. And it's a stark contrast to the just wild excess of the prophets of Baal. And I want to point out the nature of Elijah's prayer, because sometimes there are Christians who pray more like the prophets of Baal than like Elijah. They think they have to get God's attention somehow by praying loud enough or long enough or with the right kind of formula or with enough boldness or with some sort of spiritual sounding language or they got to make some kind of bargain with God. But God doesn't work that way. And prayer doesn't work that way. Elijah just very calmly talks to God. It's a beautiful story. Verse 36, here's what he prays. At the time of the sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and he prayed, O Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel and that I'm your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, O Lord. Answer me so these people will know that you, O Lord, are God and that you are turning their hearts back again. God, do this not for me, Elijah says, not so I'll be victorious, but so they will know that you are God. Do you understand what he's asking for, what he's praying for, what he's saying here? Do this for your glory, God. Don't do this for revenge. Don't do this so I'll look good. Don't do this so that, I'll save some face in some kind of way. Do this for your glory. Draw people back to you. And God sees, and God cares, and God answers Elijah's prayer. In verse 38, he sends fire from heaven down and it burns up the sacrifice. And not just the sacrifice, but it burns up the wood and the stones and the soil, and it licks up the water in the trench. And now the people, when they see this, when they experience this, they cry out, the Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. You remember Elijah's name? The Lord, He is God. And the prophets of Baal are defeated and destroyed. And that's not all. In verse 41, Elijah gives Ahab another command. He says, go eat and drink, for there's the sound of a heavy rain. Now, remember, it hadn't rained for years. And when Elijah says this, there's not a cloud in the sky. But he commands Ahab, he says, go eat and drink because the rain's coming in. So Ahab says, okay, and he goes to eat and drink. And then Elijah prays again, and I'll bet he prayed really hard at this point because 7 times he asks his servant for a weather update, and it's blue skies each time. But finally, on the 7th time, the servant says there's a little cloud rising from the sea, no bigger than a man's fist. And Elijah tells his servant to instruct Ahab to ride in his chariot to the palace in Jezreel because the rain is coming. But Elijah decides that he's actually going to go for a jog to Jezreel. Now, look at chapter 18, verse 46. It says, the power of the Lord came upon Elijah, and tucking his cloak into his belt, he ran ahead of Ahab all the way to Jezreel. Now, here's the kicker. The run from Mount Carmel to Jezreel is about 16 miles. 16 miles Elijah runs in record time. Now, here's what we got to do. Try to imagine Ahab sitting in his chariot, okay? And all he can think of is Elijah. I mean, Elijah calls for a drought that's been ruining him for years. Elijah eludes him for years. Elijah shows up voluntarily issuing orders to Ahab. Elijah single-handedly challenges all the people, mocks, defeats, and destroys the prophets of Baal. And so Ahab is going to have to try to figure out a way to tell his wife, Jezebel, about all that. And so he's on his way back to the palace, and Elijah predicts the end of the drought and sends driving instructions to Ahab by his servant. He doesn't even tell Ahab directly. He actually has a servant giving orders to the king. And Ahab is thinking, well, at least on this ride, I'll have a few hours away from this guy. And then he looks out the window of his chariot there, and Elijah is kind of waving as he's passing them by, like, see you at the palace, your highness, you know. Elijah has outfoxed Ahab's soldiers, he's outprayed Ahab's prophets, and now he's outrunning Ahab's horses. How many people in the history of the human race have ever experienced the manifestation of the power of God like Elijah has? And if it seems odd to you that a man is outrunning a chariot, it is. It is crazy. God is revealing himself in an incredible and powerful way through Elijah. And it's because of what's at stake at this point in the history of Revelation. People got to decide. The idolatry thing can't keep going on. Elijah experiences unbelievable power from God. And that's what makes the next chapter so fascinating. Don't miss this. 1 Kings 19, here's what we read. Now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, may the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them. And then this verse, Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. I mean, this is Elijah who defied a king, who defeated 400 prophets of Baal and another 400 prophets of Asherah, who took on an entire nation single-handedly, who survived by ravens at a brook, all by the power of God. This same Elijah runs at the threat of one queen, Jezebel. Now, it's an interesting thing. This turnabout is so sudden and so dramatic that a lot of Old Testament scholars, they're convinced that this part of the story is out of place and must have happened at some other time in Elijah's life. But I don't think so. I think this is exactly the way life works. See, nobody stays on the mountaintop forever. Nobody. Everybody spends some time in the valley. I mean, here's the truth about your life and mine. You and I will have spiritual peaks and valleys as long as we live. And sometimes it's after an unbelievable, adrenaline-filled, record-setting run of achievement and spiritual victory that you actually find yourself most vulnerable to doubt and fear and depression. And that's exactly what happens with Elijah. As high as he is in chapter 18, well, that's as low as he gets in chapter 19. Verse 4, when Elijah came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there while he himself went a day's journey into the desert. He came to a broom tree, sat down under it, and prayed. Check this out. He prayed that he might die. I've had enough, Lord. I've had enough. That's an amazing prayer. I mean, this same Elijah who prayed fire down from heaven, he prayed for rain and a drought was ended, who prayed for strength and outran a chariot, he now prays for one more thing: God, just let me die. And the good news is that sometimes God loves you so much, he doesn't give you what you ask for. What God does do is attend to Elijah's needs. God knows what Elijah needs better than Elijah does. In 1 Kings 19, verse 5, God sends help. And God attends to him. He just has Elijah sleep for a long period of time, and then he gives him some food, and then he has him sleep some more. That cycle's repeated a couple of times. I mean, God kind of treats Elijah like a cranky 2-year-old. Here's some goldfish in a juice box, have a snack, take a nap kind of thing. And then 40 days of rest and being alone with God and speaking to God in prayer, just Elijah and God in the valley, in the wilderness there. And then verse 9, Elijah goes into a cave, he spends the night, and then the word of the Lord came to him. What are you doing here, Elijah? I mean, Elijah has classic signs of depression, suicidal thoughts. He has to be reminded to eat and sleep. He also has a distorted perspective. So when he answers God, he complains. God says, what are you doing here, Elijah? And he says, the Israelites have rejected your covenant. They've broken down your altars, put your prophets to death by the sword. But that's not true. It was Jezebel who put prophets to death. But he says it was all of Israel. And that's what happens to people when we get so low. I mean, our perspective of reality can get distorted. And you can bet there's a little voice inside Elijah saying to himself, you call yourself a prophet? You have more doubt and fear than the people that you preach to, Elijah. You ran out on God after all he did for you. You left the people just when they started turning from Baal and needed you most. There's no way God could ever use somebody like you again. I mean, you can bet that voice is rattling around inside Elijah's head. But God sees, and God cares, and God does an amazing thing. In verse 11, the Lord said, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord's about to pass by. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord wasn't in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord wasn't in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord wasn't in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. And then a voice said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? It's the same question. And Elijah runs through his complaint once again in verse 14, same complaint he had in verse 10. Elijah's still giving that same complaint. And we wonder, what's God going to do with him? Is God going to give up on him? Well, not at all. And don't miss what God does for him. The Lord says to him, beginning in verse 15, he says, go back the way you came. And God gives him a new perspective. Actually, in verse 18, he says, you're not alone, Elijah. There are thousands of others who stand with you and me. They haven't bent the knee to Baal. You're not alone, Elijah. He gives him that new perspective. He gives him a new friend whose name is Elisha. He's going to link up with Elijah, and they're going to minister together for a period of time. And then God gives him a new assignment. He says, go back the way you came. I have new leaders for you to anoint. I have a new prophet for you to train. I mean, sometimes when people are hurting really bad, what they need most is a sense of purpose, a sense of renewal. They need to know God still has something for them to do, that they are still so valuable and precious and capable in God's eyes. And that's what God does for Elijah. I don't know if you've ever seen those Avenger movies. Last year came the big one, Avengers Endgame. And there's a significant character throughout these Avenger movies. His name is Thor. And in Avengers Endgame, Thor has a tough go of it. I mean, for most of Thor's life, so many of the other movies, it's been kind of like a 1 Kings 18 sort of story. Thor, he's bold. At times, he courageously stands alone for the greater good. He defeats all these enemies, conquering evil in the universe. He wields this hammer, Thor's hammer, and there's this inscription on his hammer, whosoever holds this hammer, if he be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor. And it's a lot of power. I'm kind of getting chills just thinking about it right now. But in Avengers Endgame, Thor is struggling. It's more like a 1 Kings 19 sort of moment for him. He's very low. He has all these doubts about his value and his worth and his place in it all. He feels like a failure. But there's a moment in Avengers Endgame where he's actually able to wield the hammer again. And he's sort of deemed as one who is worthy. And you see how he doubted himself, but he's deemed as worthy. Elijah, there in the valley, praying to die, hears from God a recommissioning of sorts. Elijah has this moment when he hears from God, you're still worthy. Sometimes we need a reaffirmation of our identity found in the one true God. This is an incredible story. I mean, many places in the Old Testament we're given the story of a call, a commissioning of somebody, of Abraham or Moses or Gideon. This is a rare kind of thing here that we see with Elijah. This is a recommissioning. This is a recall. Elijah needs to know God still has something for him to do. And that's what God does for him. And Elijah goes back down the mountain, and he begins a whole new chapter in this great adventure with God. So here's what I'd like for you to do this week. I'd like for you to read 1 Kings 18 and 19. Maybe read it again if you haven't ever read it before. And do a little bit of self-evaluation. You know, where are you in the story? I mean, maybe for you it is like a 1 Kings 18 sort of time period in your life. You have a great deal of courage. You sense God's presence and power very near to you in your life. You know, there's a boldness and an energy that's vibrant in your life. And that's a good thing. Celebrate that for sure. But maybe it's more of a 1 Kings 19 sort of chapter for you at this point in time in your story. I mean, just like Elijah, you know, your hope is slipping. I mean, maybe you know what it's like to have your hope slip. You're tired and you're not really energized. Even evaluate what God does for Elijah here. He attends to his physical needs. And again, do some self-evaluation. Are you eating and sleeping right? He gives him a true perspective. Are you soaking in the truth? Are you kind of building your life around some things that you don't know to be true or they're just false? Are you alone? See, God gives Elijah community. He gives him someone to lean on, someone to encourage him. And is there a renewal of purpose going on in your life? I mean, when was the last time you wrestled with your purpose? God, he gave Elijah something to do. God gives him a task, you see. There is hope in the valley. And to anybody who's ever felt what Elijah felt there in chapter 19, you know, I've had enough. If you ever get tired or depressed or afraid, or you ever feel like you've blown it and wonder if maybe God's not going to use you the same way anymore, I want to invite us right now to do what Elijah did and just run to God. Just find our refuge in God. You know, there's no better place in the world to run when you feel utterly defeated and frustrated or forgotten. I mean, the opportunity we have to give God what's troubling us is just incredible. And so let's take a moment right now to do what Elijah did and just to run to God with whatever it is that's on your heart, whatever's troubling you. Band's going to sing this song, Cast My Cares. It's a great way for us to think about this. And then I'll come back up and close us off. Well, thanks for tuning in this week. I hope it's been the highlight of your week. And I hope you have a fantastic week. I hope you have a fantastic Mother's Day weekend. It's so important to celebrate and honor and bless and encourage our moms. And it's important to read our moms, to kind of see how they're doing, how they're holding up throughout all this. To help with that, I actually have the top 10 signs the home quarantine is getting to mom. All right, I thought we'd go out this way. These are the top 10 signs the home quarantine is getting to mom. Number 10, she started coughing in your elbow. Number 9, she repainted your room with black paint and stenciled a giant skull and crossbones on the ceiling. Number 8, she tucks you in each night by saying, I brought you into this world, I can take you out. Number 7, she called the police on you 3 times for breaking her sound ordinance. Number 6, she applied 22 times to appear on Wife Swap. The number 5 sign the home quarantine is getting to mom, she changed the Netflix password to the answer is no. Number 4, she's gotten really good at hide and seek. Number 3, she only brushes her teeth on casual Fridays. Number 2, she flipped around all the door handles in the house and keeps locking you in your room. And the number 1 sign the home quarantine is getting to Mom, she keeps telling you not to make a big deal out of Mother's Day. So there you go. Have a terrific week, everybody. We'll see you right back here next week. Same bat time, same bat channel. See ya. Oh, never gonna hit that thing.